What if your burnout isn't proof that you're weak, but rather your nervous system's perfectly reasonable protest against a life that no longer fits the person you're becoming? If that's true, then the fastest relief might not be to push harder, but to change how you carry energy, attention, and meaning through a month that feels like two. Stay with me, because before we're done, I'll show you a simple way to track 3 versions of you that quietly govern every hard decision you make, and we'll use that map to turn urgency into steadiness rather than more chaos. Before we go further, a humane disclaimer. I'm a clinician, not your clinician. Everything you're about to hear is education, not diagnosis or treatment. People and contexts differ. If something here stirs distress or feels personally relevant, please consider discussing it with a qualified professional who can take your full history into account. If you're in immediate danger or considering harming yourself, contact local emergency services or your country's crisis resources right now. You matter more than finishing a video. Lately, many people describe their days as dense, like time has been vacuum sealed. That sensation, more tasks, more news, more emotional crosswinds packed into the same calendar, doesn't necessarily mean time is speeding in a literal sense. In clinical language, it often means arousal is running high. The stress system is more frequently in mobilize mode, narrowing attention, shortening patience, and compressing the sense of spaciousness in your day. Think of your mind like a high-rise that was engineered for typical wind loads. If the winds double, you don't blame the building for swaying. You check the dampers, widen evacuation routes, and reduce unnecessary weight. The dampers in a human nervous system are practices that slow your inner spin enough to keep judgment online. No mystery here. Steady breathing, sensory anchoring, micropauses, warm connection, nature cues. None of these are magical, and none of them fix a harmful environment by themselves. But they are the difference between being shaved down by wind and learning to lean into it without cracking. Let me introduce someone I'll call Lynn, a composite drawn from several clients and colleagues. Lynn is competent, admired, and chronically over-enrolled in other people's urgencies. She has a career she once dreamed about, a team that trusts her, and a body that has started to protest in whispers she keeps postponing. Emails at 2 a.m, a jaw that aches most days by noon, the creeping belief that if she rests, something essential will collapse. What Lynn keeps telling herself is almost noble. This is just a season. Push through, there's no good time to stop. What her physiology keeps signaling is less poetic. You're outside your window of tolerance too often, so your brain is budgeting for survival, not growth. In that budgeting mode, attention narrows. The future feels like a hallway you sprint down without seeing the doors. When we met, she described August as 2 months stapled together. Not because the calendar changed, but because her arousal did. There's a popular story that people like Lynn are simply poor at boundaries. Sometimes that's true. Far more often, they're loyal to an identity that once kept them safe. I'm useful when I over-deliver. And that identity hasn't been updated to match the current load. In cognitive behavioral terms, a core belief was adaptive in one context, then overgeneralized. We explored that without shame. I asked Lynn to sketch 3 versions of herself: who she had been when over-delivering made sense, who she was right now in honest terms, and who she suspected she was becoming if she allowed the truth to mature. She laughed at the assignment, then cried while completing it. The picture of her past self was brave and tired. The present one was precise and brittle. The future one was wide-angled and, crucially, less glamorous. Fewer committees, more deep work. Fewer people-pleasing yeses, more principled no's. In acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, we might call that values clarification. In ordinary speech, it's telling the truth about what you can carry and who you're trying to be. You'll hear spiritual or personal growth communities talk about identity shifts as if they're sudden costume changes. Clinically, they more often feel like spiral staircases. You keep circling a theme from a slightly higher vantage. 1 hour, you're flooded by an old memory and act like the earlier you. The next hour, you're solidly present. The hour after that, you sense intuitively what your next chapter wants to be. None of this means you're unstable. It means the brain is integrating, comparing old rules with current data and future intent. If you notice that oscillation this month, you're not failing to stay consistent. You're practicing the only form of consistency that holds under pressure, staying related to yourself as you change. Another composite, whom I'll call Marco, illustrates a different pivot. Empathy that once felt holy begins to feel like drowning. He is the friend who absorbs any room's pain before anyone else notices it. He anticipates need, moves chairs before someone asks, hears the tremor in a voice over a bad connection. This sensitivity was forged in a childhood where his ability to detect micro shifts in mood kept conflicts from escalating. That same gift now leaves him wrung out. He tells me he's a bad person if he can't hold space for everyone's worst moment. When we tease that apart, a quieter truth emerges. He has learned to equate intensity with meaning. If he is saturated with feelings, his own or others, life proves itself significant. But this too is a budget, and it is wildly expensive. The research is crisp. Empathic distress, the kind where you mirror other people's suffering without adequate boundaries, predicts burnout. Compassion, by contrast, is distinct. It keeps a sense of warm concern while maintaining perspective, and training can increase it. In practice, the shift looks small from the outside and enormous on the inside. Instead of, let me feel this as much as you do, it becomes, let me stay steady enough to be useful. That steadiness is not coldness. It's the only way to offer warmth that heals rather than collapses you. The open secret in work like this is that we don't stop feeling because we get better at boundaries. In fact, you may feel more, not less. What changes is where you place your inner compass. If your attention is always glued to wounds, your nervous system will organize around threat. If your attention can include repair, relief, and healthy pleasure, your system widens the corridor of what's tolerable. For Marco, we started with an unflashy practice. When someone shared something hard, he silently named one sign of resilience he heard alongside the pain. I didn't ask him to interrupt, fix, or cheerlead. I asked him to keep both channels audible. Within weeks, he noticed that his shoulders stayed lower after long conversations. He was still moved. He was no longer devoured. This is where anger sneaks in and asks to be understood instead of punished. It's common to hear that anger is a problem to eliminate. In therapy rooms, I experience it as a courier. Sometimes it carries an urgent note. A boundary has been crossed. Sometimes it's covering grief or humiliation it thinks you can't stand to feel. Either way, the body experience is often the same. Heat, speed, a wish to strike outward or shut down. If you've been taught that any anger makes you unlovable or dangerous, you'll cork it and it will ferment into something sharper. If you've been rewarded for erupting, you may overuse it and confuse intensity with power. There is a third path, and I'll come back to it more fully. Use anger's clean burn to illuminate the edge of what matters. Then move the energy through your body safely before you choose a response. That order matters. The fastest way to make poor decisions is to pretend you can reason while your nervous system is still sprinting. When people say the world feels particularly volatile, they're not imagining it. Systems that once felt predictable are jittery. Workplaces restructure in a quarter, platforms change rules overnight, communities renegotiate norms under strain. If you've grown up believing that stability should be guaranteed if you follow the rules, this can feel like betrayal. If your early life was unpredictable, this may simply feel like a louder version of an old soundtrack. In either case, your locus of control needs recalibration. We talk about building distress tolerance, but that phrase can sound like white-knuckling. What we actually aim for is flexible control, knowing the difference between spheres of influence, concern, and surrender. That knowledge is not philosophical, it's somatic. It looks like scanning your day and sorting tasks into what you can decide, what you can request, and what you must adapt around. It looks like practicing small, consistent refusals where you have agency so that your refusals stay believable when it counts. A brief return to Lynn. The turning point wasn't a dramatic resignation, it was a slow redesign of how she distributed her care. She picked 2 responsibilities to release and gave herself permission to withstand the discomfort of disappointing people she respected. We rehearsed those conversations in session so her body would recognize the terrain, a standard exposure approach. She thought the fallout would be catastrophic. It wasn't. A few weeks of awkwardness, and then an unexpected quiet opened in her schedule. Into that quiet drifted something she hadn't felt in a while: curiosity. The difference between urgency and curiosity is the difference between a clenched fist and an open palm. One can grip for a time, the other can build. The phrase many clients use for the past year is compressed time. Under the hood, the more precise phrase is reduced attentional bandwidth. High arousal narrows the spotlight, and our culture rewards that narrowing until it backfires. You've likely seen this in your own life. The more you stack obligations, the more your brain opts for familiar, low-effort loops. This is why you can lose an hour to scrolling, even when you care deeply about the world. Your brain isn't immoral, it's exhausted. Paradoxically, a practice that looks like doing less can restore your capacity to do the thing that matters. Even 90 seconds of deliberate downshift, slow exhale, eyes on one stable point, attention widened to include peripheral vision, tells your threat system that you're not currently being chased. It gives your prefrontal cortex oxygen and a chance to make sense rather than noise. Will a breathing pause fix unjust workloads, or grief, or war? Of course not. But it is a bridge between an honest appraisal of danger and the next wise step. Some people worry that if they stop to regulate, they'll lose their edge. I invite them to consider athletes. No one argues that a sprinter wastes time by exhaling in the blocks. Regulation is not the opposite of performance. It is the precondition for performance that doesn't cannibalize tomorrow's capacity. You can try this as an experiment instead of a commitment. Choose one meeting or one commute and enter it with the explicit intention to stay aware of breath and shoulder tension without changing your words at all. Then notice two things: where you were tempted to oversell yourself from anxiety and where you spoke more clearly because you were not grasping. That's data. You can build from data without superstition. There's another theme I hear constantly from people who care about the world: the sense that destabilization isn't accidental. Some of it isn't. Misinformation thrives when people are scared and tired. So does coercion. I'm not a political theorist, but I am a clinician who sees what chronic fear does to cognition. It makes people both more rigid and more suggestible. The antidote is not to pretend things are fine or to marinate in dread. The antidote is layered. Accurate information from diverse sources, deliberate community, somatic practices that keep you resourced enough to think, and small collective actions congruent with your values. A person regulated enough to appraise reality is much harder to hurt. If the phrase "call for change" sounds grandiose to you, scale it down. Call for change inside your own routines first, then between you and one other person, then in a room where you hold even a sliver of influence. Grand movements are a sum of plenty of plain ones. We should name dissociation with care. It has become a catch-all word online for zoning out, but clinically it ranges from mild spacing to protective shutdown. If you've survived overwhelming experiences, your brain learned a skill: leave the scene without leaving the room. That skill can keep you alive in an acute crisis and then overgeneralize into contexts where you'd prefer to be present. If you realize you're losing time, missing conversations, or feeling distant from your own body more often, please don't add shame on top. Your system did something smart. Now it needs options. Grounding can be as humble as cold water on the wrists, the feel of your feet, naming 5 sounds in your environment. Sometimes this feels insultingly simple. Often it works enough to choose something kinder than autopilot. And if you notice persistent dissociation that interferes with work or relationships, that's one of the clearest invitations to seek trauma-informed care. You don't have to white-knuckle your way back. Let's lace in a different kind of story, a delayed awakening. I'll call her Aya. For years, she assumed she was just anxious. She drank too much coffee, worked through lunch, powered through headaches, and treated weekends like recovery wards for weekday wounds. Then one afternoon, she froze on a harmless video call. The conversation was friendly, the stakes low, and still her hands went numb. Words moved as if they belonged to someone else. It frightened her enough to try therapy, where she expected to be handed tricks to speak better. What she discovered instead was that her body had been negotiating with old alarms from family life she'd refused to name. We spent months not fixing her performance, but widening her permission to feel helpless in controlled doses, so she could stop performing competence all the time. As her capacity for helplessness increased, her actual competence returned, this time with less theater. Helping Aya wake up didn't look like inspiring speeches. It looked like 15-minute sessions of carefully titrated emotion, followed by walks outside to remind her brain that the ground could hold her. I bring up Aya because many of you have been holding your breath for a long time without noticing it. You may be doing everything right and still feel a low-grade panic about the pace of change. There is a grief hidden inside accelerated seasons. We lose rituals of transition. Human systems crave liminal spaces, thresholds where we metabolize what just happened before we sprint into what's next. When a month feels like 2, rituals become survival gear. These don't need to be ornate. I ask people to create a 10-minute closing ritual at the end of each week. Write 3 true sentences. What demanded more than you expected? What you gave that you want to honor? What you want to carry forward? Then put your hand on your chest and take 4 slow breaths while looking at a living thing, a plant, a pet, a tree outside. For many, this is the first time all week their nervous system receives a clear, "We're done enough for now." That's not laziness, it's integration. Sometimes the impulse to change catches you off guard and arrives as a surprise opportunity you don't trust yet. People often call these detours, but if you didn't see an offer coming and it lands with a mix of fear and rightness, it may be that your future has been assembling itself quietly while you were busy surviving, and now the scaffolding is ready. This does not make every surprise wise. It does mean you can learn to distinguish the pull of growth from the push of pressure. Growth feels like expansion with responsibility. You still have to do the work, and you will be a beginner again somewhere. Pressure feels like contraction with threat. Your nervous system believes bad things will happen if you don't comply. The body knows the difference. If you're unsure, ask it 3 questions while imagining saying yes. Do I breathe more easily? Do I feel more options? And do I sense a wider future? If 2 out of 3 are no, wait. When in doubt, I'd rather you disappoint someone than betray yourself. The cleanup for disappointment is almost always smaller. You may be wondering when we'll get to something concrete you can practice without turning your life inside out. You already have. The practice is telling the truth in small behavior-level ways that your body can trust. You can craft this like a builder plans a load path. Find the beam that's bearing weight it wasn't designed for, and move a little of that load to a column that can handle it. In real life, that might be a weekly meeting that lasts an hour longer than it needs to, because silence equals agreement. You don't have to be a hero. You can become the person who says, with kindness, "I'm noticing we're repeating ourselves. Could we capture decisions and close 10 minutes early?" That sentence, practiced, can return hundreds of minutes to your month over a year and teach your brain that you're not at the mercy of tides you can't name. There is a reason many of us feel more reactive right now. The volume of stimuli competing for your care has increased while rituals of rest have thinned. You are not broken for struggling inside that equation. You're accurate. When you recognize accuracy, shame tends to loosen its grip. After accuracy, the next right thing is usually smaller than you think. In dialectical behavior therapy, we sometimes use the phrase build mastery to describe doing one thing you can complete in the direction you want to go. Not because it changes your whole life, but because it resupplies your sense that you can influence your life. It might be mailing the form you've avoided, cooking a real meal once this week, or making a medical appointment you keep postponing because you're scared of the answer. These seem trivial to outsiders. They are not trivial to your nervous system. Each one tells your body that you are a participant, not a passenger. We still need to talk about the moment anger arrives like a lightning strike and what to do with that voltage so it becomes a boundary rather than a blast. We still need to walk through a specific, respectful way to update identity that doesn't require burning down what built you. And we still need to make room for collective healing, the difference between self-regulation and co-regulation in families, friendships, and teams. So you don't try to shoulder what was meant to be shared. We'll get there. For now, notice if your breath is a little slower, your shoulders a little lower, or your attention a little wider. That's not because I said something clever. It's because a small part of you is remembering how to come back to yourself while the world keeps moving. When you can do that for 60 seconds, you become the kind of person who can do it for 5 minutes, and then for the length of a meeting, and then through a hard week. That's what real change feels like from the inside, unglamorous steadiness that compounds into a life you don't have to escape. You asked for a way to turn anger's voltage into a boundary rather than a blast. So let's start where that electricity first sparks, in the body, not the argument. Before anger becomes words, it is speed and heat. Your pulse rises, vision narrows, breath climbs into the upper chest, and thoughts simplify into all or nothing. Nothing terribly mystical there. The brain is prioritizing survival. If you try to negotiate a complex boundary while your system is still sprinting, you will either overpromise, overpunish, or say something technically true and relationally lethal. The sequence that works in therapy rooms is ordinary and repeatable. First, let the current pass through safely. Cold water, a slow exhale that is longer than the inhale, a brief walk, pushing a wall, shaking out your hands, anything that discharges enough charge for your prefrontal cortex to rejoin the call. Second, name what the anger is protecting. Usually it's a value, a boundary, or a wound. Third, approach the conversation with one simple sentence you can stand behind tomorrow. You are not being asked to be calm before you are safe. You are being asked to let safety happen inside your skin before you speak as if you are calm. I think of Haru, another composite. He was admired for being unflappable, which meant he swallowed everything until he didn't. One afternoon, a colleague made a cutting joke about his workload, and he heard his own voice say a sentence he didn't know he was capable of, a sentence that turned the room to ice. Shame followed rage, then silence, then a story about how he was the problem. In session, we rewound the tape together. The joke wasn't neutral. It brushed a raw spot he had been keeping numb. 3 months of doing two people's jobs without acknowledgement. His anger was a messenger banging on a locked door. We practiced what his body could do in the first 30 seconds the next time a line was crossed. Eyes to a fixed point, longer out-breath, feet heavy, jaw loose, and a line he could say that didn't scorch the earth he had to stand on tomorrow. I'm not available for jokes about my workload. If we need to redistribute tasks, I'm game to talk logistics. He felt robotic at first, then he felt relief. The room didn't improve all at once. What improved was his ability to keep his own company while asking for fair treatment, and that changed the room over time. You also asked how to update identity without burning down what built you. Demolition gets attention. Renovation sustains a life. An identity is a set of promises you made to survive. The promises worked until the price did not. When you sense it's time to change, grief arrives with your growth. You are not just choosing new habits, you are retiring a version of you who kept you safe. In architectural terms, you don't rip out load-bearing walls just because you dislike the paint. You study the load path and design temporary supports. Clinically, that means naming what you will keep while you change what you must. If your always say yes was a shield against rejection, you might keep your generosity and retire your compulsion. If your fix everything made you essential in a chaotic family, you might keep your competence and retire the drama you needed to feel valuable. People sometimes think therapy is about finding a new self. Most days, it is about giving the self you already are more honest conditions to stand upright. An instructive mistake here is what I call graduation guilt. Many people delay healthy change because they feel they owe their old roles one last tour of duty. They keep mentoring a project they should hand off. They retain a client whose needs have outgrown their scope. They say yes to one more committee because they have no one else. There is kindness in that impulse and danger too. If you graduate and keep living in your old dorm, the new class has nowhere to sleep. In practice, that means your old role will not evolve because your presence protects it from growing up. The compassionate move is not to stay longer. It is to leave cleanly, offer what you can in transition, and allow a system to adapt without you. I've watched careers, relationships, and bodies heal when people let this truth be operational rather than sentimental. It is not abandonment to stop carrying what was never designed to be permanent. Let's come back to time feeling compressed and the sense that the world is tugging at your sleeves. One response to this squeeze is a lonely kind of self-reliance. If the world is unstable, I must become a fortress. Another response is to become permeable in every direction and call it compassion. Neither is sustainable. Humans regulate together as much as we regulate alone, and co-regulation is not a tender buzzword. It's the oldest technology we have. Your heart rate changes when you sit with someone steady. Your breath slows when you speak to a friend who is not speeding. Children borrow the calm of adults. Adults borrow each other's too. In families and teams, it can help to make this explicit. Share the plan for taking short regulation breaks before you need them so they are not mistaken for avoidance. Say out loud, "If this conversation spikes, I'd like us to pause for 90 seconds, then resume." Walk while you talk when the topic is charged. Bilateral movement often gives the nervous system more room to feel without flooding. End meetings with decisions captured clearly, so ambiguity doesn't grow teeth after dark. None of this is therapy, it is hygiene. Shifting the compass for highly empathic people can be delicate work because their identity is often lovingly bound to being the person who feels the most. If that's you, try this reframe. Your gift is not that you feel more than others. It's that you can keep feeling without losing your capacity to act. That distinction is everything. Empathic distress is a form of drowning. Compassion is a form of swimming. You are not less kind because you chose not to go under with someone. You are less available to help if you do. There is research to back this, but you don't need a citation to test it. After a hard conversation, notice whether you reach for numbing or for nourishment. If it's numbness every time, your system is telling you that you exceeded your window. Where possible, shorten conversations, widen intervals, name limits at the top, rather than waiting until the end, and keep a practice that reminds your body what safe enough feels like before you re-enter the world. You cannot build a life out of triage. A preventable downfall often starts as a small, noble compromise. I think of Jay, a nonprofit leader who promised herself she would say no to evening events for 1 quarter to see if her migraines improved. Then a donor asked a favor that would only take an hour, and missing it might send the wrong message. And it was for the mission after all. 1 hour became 3, and the promise was renamed flexibility in her mind. 2 months later, she was on my couch with emergency room discharge papers and a neurologist's recommendation to cut her workload by 1/3. The catastrophe looked sudden from the outside. Inside, it was a chain of sensible-sounding exceptions braided together. If you often feel you have to choose between loyalty and your body, please write this down in your own words and place it where you can see it. Loyalty is not measured by your willingness to be harmed. People who benefit from your harm may sincerely prefer you keep the old arrangement. That preference does not obligate you to keep paying. You might be wondering how any of this touches the larger feeling many of us carry, that destabilization is, at least in part, engineered. Chronic fear is good for business in some sectors and good for control in others. From a clinical angle, the risk is the same regardless of motive. The more persistently frightened and exhausted you are, the easier you are to influence and the more rigid your thinking becomes. Flexibility of mind is an outcome of a flexible body state. You don't have to ignore the world to protect that. You do have to curate your inputs enough to preserve your ability to think and care at the same time. That might look like choosing 2 or 3 high-quality sources, scheduling when you'll read them, and refusing doom scrolls that train your system to expect impact without agency. It might look like joining or convening a small group where you practice translating concern into proportionate action, not to fix the world in a night, but to prevent the learned helplessness that follows chronic exposure to insoluble problems. When dissociation enters the picture, I try to treat it as a teacher rather than an enemy. Your system learned to flip a circuit breaker when the amperage was too high. Thank the breaker before you reset it. Then practice pendulation, the gentle movement of attention between something safe and something difficult. You might put one hand on your leg and notice the pressure while you recall a hard conversation for 5 seconds, then return attention to hand on leg for 10, then dip back into the memory for another 5. This is not a trick to erase what happened. It is a way to show your body that you can touch what hurts and return, that you have exits and aren't trapped in a single corridor. Many people are surprised at how quickly their tolerance grows when they do this with respect rather than force. Respect here means you stop before you're overwhelmed and you go slower than your pride wants. Slowness is not indulgence, it's precision. I promised earlier we would get specific about using anger for architecture rather than arson. After discharge and naming, the 3rd step is design. Decide what you want the boundary to do. Do you want to inform, request, or enforce? Informing sounds like, I won't continue if that tone persists. Requesting sounds like, I'm available to talk after we've both rested. Enforcing sounds like ending the call or leaving the room without slamming the door. Which you choose depends on history and safety. Many of us overuse informing in situations that require enforcement and overuse enforcement where a clear request would do. If you are unsure, default to request with a clear next step you control, and have one enforcement you can implement without theatrics. People rarely change because you perform anger at them. They sometimes change because you become consistently different to interact with. Even if they don't, you become easier to live with from the inside. A transformation journey that worked rarely reads like a movie montage. It looks like Mina, who stopped trying to fix her entire calendar and started with a single non-negotiable. 10 minutes at the end of the day to write 3 short sentences, hand on chest, eyes on a living thing, breath longer on the out. The first week she forgot twice and almost gave up because she hated being imperfect more than she loved being helped. We talked about that, not as a personal flaw, but as an understandable allergic reaction to the feeling of not being caught up. Perfection for Mina was a way to avoid shame. We traded perfection for cadence. By the end of a month, her boss remarked that she was clearer in meetings. Nothing mystical had happened. She had given her brain enough closure to stop carrying unfinished fragments into tomorrow. From there, she had room to change a second thing. She stopped accepting meetings without agendas. People adapted. The sky did not fall. On the rare day it did, she had more umbrella. Beneath all these individual adjustments is a shared question. Who are you becoming when the pace picks up, and who do you want to become on purpose? You can honor the version of you that over-delivered without sentencing yourself to continue. You can admit that the world is loud without teaching your body that you are powerless. You can let anger burn clean enough to light the path to your boundary and not the bridge you still need to cross tomorrow. And you can do all of it imperfectly. In therapy, the moment I trust most that change will last is not when a client has a flawless week, but when they have a messy one and still keep one promise to themselves. That promise is often tiny. Tiny is not trivial. It is how nervous systems learn they are trustworthy again. We are not done. We still have to gather the strands into something you can carry forward without me. We still have to distill the 3 versions of you map into a compact practice you can run in the real world without note cards. We still have to return to the social layer, how couples and teams write rules that don't collapse under speed, and give you a humane way to measure progress that isn't a spreadsheet or a mood ring. Keep listening, and we'll close the loops we opened, not with a miracle, but with a rhythm you can actually keep. You've been carrying the question of how to translate ideas into a rhythm you can keep without me. So let's make the map small enough to fit in a pocket and real enough to change a Tuesday. Think of the 3 versions of you practice as a daily architectural sketch rather than a confessional. The point isn't to judge yesterday or to fantasize about tomorrow. The point is to align how you spend this hour with the person you're deliberately rehearsing. In the morning, before your attention is auctioned off, write a single honest line about who you were yesterday that you're done impersonating. A single accurate line about who you actually are today without performance. And a single line about the person you're becoming, stated as if you were already in motion. That 3rd line becomes the day's design constraint. If the becoming you values steadiness over spectacle, then the way you answer one email or schedule one conversation is part of the construction plan. This is not grand. It is specific. Specific is how brains learn. If you forget, resume when you notice. The nervous system doesn't need you to be flawless. It needs you to be findable. People often ask how this practice relates to cognitive work, and the answer is that it sits on top of it like a clean roof. When your mind begins to sprint toward catastrophe, the project will implode. The relationship is doomed. The future is a corridor with no doors. You can use very ordinary cognitive behavioral moves to dispute the thought without shaming yourself for having it. Ask what the evidence is. Ask for counter-evidence, and ask what a friend who loves you but isn't impressed by your theatrics would say. Even 10% less certainty in the catastrophic direction returns choice to your hands. Then use that space to rejoin the 3 versions map, not by pretending everything is fine, but by making one move that the becoming you would recognize as her own. It's time we bring the social layer back into view, because most of what derails good intentions happens between people. Couples and teams don't collapse because they lack love or talent. They fray because stress multiplies small ambiguities into big injuries. This is where co-regulation turns from a pleasant idea into a working agreement. Teach the people you live and work with how to help you stay in the conversation when it gets hot, and learn how to help them without trying to become their therapist. Make it explicit that short pauses are not exits. Agree on a phrase that means we are pausing to settle rather than punishing each other with silence. Walk during hard talks if you can. The rhythm of your body makes it easier to feel without drowning. And heated meetings or debates with a shared sentence about what exactly will happen next and who is responsible. So your threat systems don't invent stories in the dark. These are not tricks. They are ways of honoring bodies that are trying to protect the people they carry. There is a common fear that naming nervous system needs will make you sound fragile or unprofessional. What I see in rooms that function over time is the opposite. Teams that understand arousal states make fewer sloppy mistakes, change their minds more gracefully, and recover faster when they miss. Partners who can say, "I need a 2-minute reset" without contempt, fights less about the wrong thing, which is usually a proxy battle for "I don't feel safe." Safety is not the same as agreement. It is the condition that lets disagreement be useful. If you want a place to start with yourself. Before a conversation you know could spike, imagine the version of you who is becoming and ask what would make it easier for that person to show up. Then do that one small thing, even if it's as unglamorous as eating real food and putting your phone face down. We haven't finished with anger because boundaries live or die in the follow-through. You already know that discharging the body and naming the value come first. The design step asks you to decide whether you're informing, requesting, or enforcing. What remains is rehearsal, because bodies under stress revert to old scripts unless new lines have been practiced out loud. Rehearsal can feel silly in a quiet room. It is also why you won't overcorrect later. Say the sentence you chose, at full volume, with your face relaxed and your shoulders down. Notice where your breath catches. Adjust the words until you can say them without holding your body hostage. If you've been socialized to be agreeable, the first clear boundary will feel mean, regardless of its content. If you've been socialized to be intimidating, the first contained boundary will feel weak. Feelings are not verdicts. Give them time to catch up to reality. Let's close one more loop by returning to dissociation with the respect it deserves. If you recognize that you leave your body more than you'd like, I don't want you to white-knuckle your way back. Use pendulation like a tide chart. Touch the hard thing, return to the safe thing, then touch the hard thing again. If the hard thing is a memory, start with a clip rather than the whole film. If the hard thing is a person, start with hearing their name rather than imagining their face. You are not being lazy by going slowly. You are practicing precision with the very instrument you use to live. When this work is done inside therapy, we add scaffolding, resourcing, titration, repair, so you're not left alone in the middle. If you're doing it on your own, choose tiny doses and pair them with something alive in your senses. A warm mug, the texture of fabric, the feel of gravity on your feet. These are not hacks. They are cues that remind a vigilant brain that the present is different from the past. Identity renovation is easier to talk about in theory than in households. The minute you stop playing an old role, people who benefited from the old arrangement will notice that their comfort has become more expensive. If they love you, they may still prefer you the old way because the old way cost them less. This is not villainy, it's math. It is your job to feel that tug without granting it jurisdiction. When guilt arrives, treat it as a weather pattern, not a legal ruling. Guilt is good at telling you that something changed. It is not reliable at telling you whether the change is wrong. Ask yourself whether the feeling is proportional to harm or to habit. If you are breaking a promise, repair or renegotiate. If you are breaking a pattern that was mistaken for a promise, stay the course kindly. In attachment terms, you are inching toward secure functioning, where love is both generous and bounded. People can learn to love you in the shape that fits your current life. Some won't. That is a cost of being a person rather than a performance. You may still worry that the suggestions here are small when the world feels big. I don't blame you. But the most reliable way I've seen people avoid learned helplessness is to shrink the stage until their actions produce visible effects, then to expand again from that base. Choose one corner of your life where a different rule is both safe and meaningful. Keep the experiment contained enough that you can observe it. If it works, duplicate it elsewhere. If it doesn't, you learn cheaply. This is the same principle that makes behavioral activation effective for depression and exposure work, powerful for anxiety. We don't ask the brain to leap to a new narrative and believe it on faith. We ask the brain to experience something slightly better and trust that experience. Evidence is quieter than fear, and fear is louder than facts. Persistence, repeated gently, gives evidence a microphone. Earlier, we touched the idea that not getting what you want can be a form of protection you don't recognize yet. This is the place where a certain kind of superstition sneaks in, either to insist that every closed door is a sign from the universe, or to insist that agency is an illusion. Discernment lives between those extremes. If a path blocks repeatedly despite proportionate effort, it might be wise to ask what this no is shielding you from, or what yes it is nudging you toward. Put different language on it if you prefer. The psychology is the same. Your attention will keep generating options when it isn't consumed with defending a single storyline. If you practice stepping back far enough to hold the disappointment and the data in the same frame, you become someone who can redirect without collapsing, which is the exact definition of resilience that actually helps. I want to fold in one last story because it stitches together many threads. Call him Noor. He co-led an engineering team that was brilliant and brittle. Deadlines kept compressing. Demands from above kept shifting. Conflict inside the team was polite and therefore corrosive. Noor absorbed the chaos. He thought that was leadership. After a scare with his heart and a doctor who talked to him bluntly about stress physiology, he decided to become uninteresting in a very specific way. He stopped performing urgency. He set one meeting each week where the only agenda was to list the unknowns out loud and sort them into what the team could decide, what they could request, and what they would have to adapt around. He began ending discussions with one-sentence decisions. He asked a colleague with a calmer voice to run the highest conflict stand-up. He He told his partner at home that on nights when he walked in looking haunted, he needed 5 minutes with his back against the wall, eyes on the ceiling, before he could be a person. In a few months, he was less romantic as a leader. He was also less essential, which turned out to be the point. When a crisis did come, the team had enough shared rhythm to be impressive without martyrdom. At home, his partner said he felt more present even if he still worked too much. Noor had not become mystical. He had become steady. That steadiness is contagious. What you might notice across these stories is that the people who changed did not become different species. They became truer to one they had been glimpsing. They learned to spend energy where it buys capacity rather than debt. They learned to let anger find the door instead of the fuse. They learned to stop equating empathy with drowning. They learned that dissociation is a door too, and that it opens both ways when you treat it with respect. Mostly, they learned to stay in relationship with themselves while they moved through a season that felt crowded. That is the practical definition of mental health, I trust. The ability to remain in conversation with yourself and others under conditions that used to end the conversation. If you need one metric that doesn't invite perfectionism, measure how quickly you return to yourself after you leave rather than how rarely you leave. Leaving will happen. You will say yes when you mean no. Scroll past your stop, forget the morning lines, clench, snap, dissolve, freeze. Recovery is the skill that makes all the other skills durable. Recovery is the micro skill of a single slow breath after you notice you're gone, the meso skill of a reset ritual at day's end, and the macro skill of rebuilding trust with your body over months by keeping one small promise more often than not. The brain loves averages. You don't have to win a day to win a month. As we close, I'll repeat the humane boundaries of this format because they matter. This is education, not diagnosis or treatment. If what we explored today lit up something specific, you deserve a space made for your history, your body, your risks, and resources. A good clinician will never punish you for needing more help than a video can carry. If you are in danger, please pause this and reach someone who can be with you in real time. If you are simply ready for company while you practice, gather two people who want the same and share what you're trying. Humans are easier to be when we are held. I promised at the very start that we would turn urgency into steadiness rather than more chaos, and that we would make a map you could carry. You now have the spine of that map, a 3-line daily sketch that orients your choices, a way to move anger through your body before you move it through a room, a compassionate upgrade of empathy into compassion that can act, a respectful approach to dissociation that restores options, and a social rhythm that makes speed less punishing. The world will likely keep moving quickly. You don't have to match its pace to belong to it. You have to be able to hear yourself while it moves and then make the next right-sized move from there. If you want to keep walking, the most natural continuation is to explore how values become schedules without turning your life into a spreadsheet, and how relationships can share the load so that no single nervous system has to be a fortress. When you're ready, we'll take that step together.